Faced with continued Russian aggression and a US that appears strategically uninterested in Europe, unless it's trying to annex Greenland, EU officials are once again pushing for a big bang rethink of Europe's common defence. Only a couple of days ago, the Defence Commissioner floated the idea of creating a standing European military force of 100,000 troops that could potentially replace US troops in the event of a mass withdrawal, and a German Green MEP has proposed the creation of a new European Security Council, based on the existing Security Council in the UN. So in this video, we're going to take a look at these latest proposals, and whether they could really pave the way for an EU army. We're in the process of clearing out our store, so we're running a fire sale right now. Using code FIRESALE, you can get 40% off all of our posters, notebooks, calendars, magnets, keyrings, Brexit the colouring book, the lot. That offer ends very soon, so click the link in the description for more. Let's start with some context. The idea of a European army was first seriously considered in 1952, when the US pushed for West Germany to rearm and join NATO. France opposed this, and instead proposed a European defence community, which would have merged the armies of 6 European states under a supranational command. The plan collapsed in 1954 when the French Parliament refused to ratify it, and when West Germany joined NATO instead. France tried to resurrect this idea in the 60s, when President Charles de Gaulle, who really didn't like Europe's growing dependence on the US, sought to turn the European Economic Community into a security alliance. But other members still preferred to stick with NATO, because, well, why would you create a new European security architecture when you already have NATO, which covers most of Europe and includes the world's biggest military in the US? Nonetheless, pretty significant progress was made towards an independent EU security policy around the turn of the millennium, when French President Jacques Chirac and British Prime Minister Tony Blair signed the St. Malo Declaration in the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars. The declaration laid the political groundwork for the EU's common security and defence policy, and set a goal to create a 60,000-strong rapid reaction force that could intervene in European crises. However, this force was never realised, and progress towards a European army regressed, as the EU enlarged with former Soviet states that overwhelmingly supported NATO membership over any European security architecture. Today, Europe's armies are a continental mishmash. European NATO countries collectively have nearly 2 million troops, but their forces are fragmented, poorly coordinated, and the bloc operates 30 separate defence procurement systems, which has driven up defence costs massively. However, the idea of an EU army returned to the table with Trump's return to the White House last January, after he began negotiating a peace deal with Russia without Ukraine's input, and told Europeans that they will be responsible for guaranteeing Ukraine's security after the war. In recent weeks, Trump has also renewed his bid to either buy or annex Greenland, and stated that the US will not rule out taking the island by force. While Trump toned down his threats during the Davos summit by ruling out military action, by this point the damage has already been done, and talks began in Brussels about preparing for a future in which NATO may no longer serve as the cornerstone of European defence. The comments that garnered the most attention were made by the EU's Defence Commissioner, who argued that the bloc should instead create a European military force of 100,000 troops, essentially an EU army. This might feel a bit far-fetched at the moment, but if transatlantic relations remain strained and Europe continues with its planned rearmament, it's not hard to imagine things continuing in this direction. Nonetheless, an EU army is definitely a long-term project that will probably require yet another contentious EU treaty. This feels unlikely in the short term, not least because the EU currently has a lot on its plate at the moment, with various outstanding disagreements over issues like debt, leaving it with little bureaucratic bandwidth and political will. However, a full-on EU army isn't the only way to beef up Europe's post-NATO security architecture. A German Green MEP, for instance, has also suggested the creation of a separate European Security Council, or ESC. Put simply, the ESC draws inspiration, both in name and structure, from the United Nations Security Council, envisioning a small group of key military powers who will be given collective responsibility for key security decisions in Europe. Again, the idea of a European Security Council isn't entirely new. It was first floated in the 1980s, and various proposals have been debated and rejected. After resurfacing in the wake of EU divisions over the 2003 Iraq War, the concept regained renewed attention in 2017, championed by former EU Executive Chief Jean-Claude Juncker and French President Emmanuel Macron. But that effort faltered, mainly due to the UK's reluctance to participate. Now, the ESC's voting procedures would apparently be modelled on those of the UNSC. Core voting members would initially include the President of the European Parliament and the 5 EU countries with the largest economies, militaries, and defence spending: France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Poland. The plan also seeks to include the UK, which obviously isn't an EU member, but is seen as an important ally, both because of its nuclear capability and high defence spending, as well as being a signal that European security is not solely the EU's responsibility. In addition, a small number of rotating EU members, initially 2, would sit on the ESC, although without voting rights, and over time the Council would expand. This would guard against a situation where a single country, for example Hungary, could veto EU-wide defence decisions, while still preserving the consent of the big players, who would presumably shoulder most of the burden in any military intervention. The idea of an ESC, which would coordinate Europe's collective defence efforts, feels more plausible than a full-on European army, both because, well, it's unlikely to face much blowback from Eurosceptics, but also because under current proposals, the Council will be established through a new intergovernmental treaty, allowing it to operate within EU law while bypassing the bloc's usual requirement for unanimous defence decisions. While this sounds kind of tricky and seems to go against the founding principles of the EU, that is, equality and unanimity between all states, such a move isn't without precedent. Take the Schengen Agreement, which today allows free movement across most EU states, which was initially created outside of EU treaties and only later incorporated into EU law. Over time, it expanded to additional members, with Bulgaria and Romania being the most recent to join last year. Another example of this multi-speed integration is the Eurozone. Not all EU states adopted the common currency, only those meeting the criteria and wishing to join did so, forming an inner core for economic decisions. But while the ESC might offer a pragmatic way to overcome paralysis in Europe's security decision-making, it comes with significant political costs. By concentrating power in the hands of a small group of large states, it risks reviving long-standing fears of a two-speed Europe, where influence is unevenly distributed and smaller countries are sidelined to secondary country status, which would only further erode European unity. Now, you're probably looking to follow this story as it develops, but how are you supposed to keep track of which outlets online are actually trustworthy, and which are just fabricating a false narrative for you to follow? Well, that's where our sponsor this week, Ground News, comes in. That's because Ground News is a website and app that helps you to make sense of the complex and ever-changing media landscape. Now, things can get increasingly overwhelming, with thousands of articles being thrown at us every day, but Ground News puts all of those articles into one place, helping you to fully understand the story from start to finish. Each article even comes with a breakdown into bias distribution, factuality, and ownership of each source. For instance, if we take this story on the Defence Commissioner saying that the bloc needs a 100,000 person standing military force, we can see that there are 70 sources currently reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the right. We can even dive into how each side is reporting on it using their bias comparison feature, showing that the left is framing the proposal as a proactive move towards strategic military autonomy, while the right employs more dismissive language, framing it as an unrealistic fantasy that's not going to fly. Our absolute favourite feature, though, is their blind spot feed. Here you can see all of the stories that you might not have seen on your feed. So even if you don't agree with the reporting, it's still good to know what's being left out of your bubble. Now, you're probably used to being fed the news that your algorithm has decided is best for you, and breaking out of that spiral is harder than ever. Ground News will do that work for you, though, freeing you from the algorithmic restraints and letting you think freely again. So if you want to start questioning the narrative, instead of just consuming it, you can join Ground News today. And using our link, you'll get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe using the link in the description. Go to ground.news/TLDR or scan the code on screen. And you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.